10,000 horses stretched across the horizon of the Central Asian steppe, their hooves kicking up a silver mist of dust. This massive herd was not inherited through royal decree or seized in a bloody raid against a rival tribe. Every single animal was the hard-earned prize of a wager won by a woman who never felt the cold touch of a wrestling mat against her back. How did a princess of the house of Genghis Khan turn the traditional marriage market into a graveyard for the egos of the finest warriors in Asia? In the late 13th century, the Mongol Empire was a fractured mosaic of rival khanates, governed by the law of the sword and the endurance of the horse. While her contemporaries in Europe were being bartered like cattle to secure distant alliances, Khutulun was busy redefining what it meant to be a daughter of the great Khan. She did not wait for a champion to defend her honor, or rely on a political marriage to secure her future. She was the champion, a physical force of nature that even the most battle-hardened veterans feared to encounter in the wrestling circle. The air in the Mongol camp usually smelled of roasted mutton and fermented mare's milk, but on the days of her matches, it smelled of anticipation and heavy sweat. Crowds gathered in the thousands, forming a ring of colorful silks and rough furs under the endless blue sky of the high plains. In the center stood Khutulun, her hair braided tight against her skull and her limbs like coiled springs of tempered iron. She was the favorite daughter of Kaidu, the most powerful ruler in Central Asia, yet in the ring she stood entirely alone. Her challenge was simple, yet devastatingly effective for any man who dared to claim her hand in marriage. To marry the princess, a suitor had to defeat her in a wrestling match that allowed for no mercy and no excuses. If he won, he gained a royal wife and a legitimate claim to a future throne. If he lost, he surrendered 100 horses to her personal herd and slunk away in public disgrace. Mongol wrestling, known as bok, was not a ceremonial sport for the faint of heart or the physically fragile. There were no weight classes to balance the odds and very few rules to protect the competitors from serious injury. It was a brutal test of leverage, balance, and raw, explosive power that could snap a man's pride as easily as his ribs. To the Mongols, wrestling was the ultimate expression of the soul's strength and a spiritual communion with the very earth they conquered. Khutulun moved with a predatory grace that masked her lethal intent, circling her opponents with the patience of a wolf. She understood the center of gravity better than the men who spent their entire lives in the saddle. When she gripped a man's leather vest, the match was often over before the dust had even settled around their feet. One by one, princes and generals found themselves staring up at the sun, gasping for air while she remained standing over them. Her father, Kaidu, watched these displays of dominance with a complex mixture of fatherly pride and strategic calculation. He did not see a daughter who was failing to secure a politically advantageous marriage for his house. Instead, he saw a brilliant general in the making, a warrior who possessed the true spirit of their ancestor, Genghis Khan. In his eyes, Khutulun was the living embodiment of the nomadic ideal, where merit outweighed gender and strength dictated destiny. As the years passed, the legend of the wrestling princess grew, drawing challengers from the farthest reaches of the Silk Road. They came with immense pride, convinced that no woman could withstand the weight and technique of a seasoned warrior. They left on foot, their stables emptied, and their reputations tarnished by a woman who refused to be conquered. The herd of 10,000 horses became a living monument to her unbroken streak of victories and her absolute independence. Yet, this unprecedented independence came with a heavy price in the high-stakes world of Mongol politics. A princess who could not be married was a princess who could not be used to seal a peace treaty or forge a vital tribal union. Rival factions within the empire began to view her not as a hero, but as a dangerous anomaly that threatened the social order. They whispered in the dark that her influence over her father was a shadow that would eventually eclipse the empire itself. The tension reached a boiling point when a particularly wealthy and handsome prince arrived, confident he would finally break her streak. He brought with him 1,000 horses, a staggering bet that caught the attention of every noble and commoner in the region. Even Kaidu, who usually championed his daughter's freedom, felt the crushing weight of the political pressure surrounding this encounter. He urged her to consider the implications of this particular match for the long-term survival of their royal house. The prince entered the ring with the swagger of a man who believed he had already won, unaware of the storm brewing in Khutulun's eyes. He was about to discover that he wasn't just wrestling a woman, but colliding with the very soul of the Mongol steppe. Chapter 2. The bloodline of Genghis Khan and Kaidu's influence. Khutulun did not just inherit a name. She inherited a world-shattering legacy that demanded constant blood and iron. She was the great-great-granddaughter of Genghis Khan, the man who had turned the nomadic tribes into a global apocalypse. Her father, Kaidu, was the grandson of Ogedei, the second great Khan and the chosen successor of the great conqueror himself. This blood was not a quiet stream, but a raging river of ambition that defined every action they took on the battlefield. By the mid-13th century, the unity of the Mongol Empire had dissolved into a bitter family feud that spanned thousands of miles across the heart of Eurasia. To the east, Kublai Khan sat on a throne of silk in China, embracing the luxuries and sedentary ways of the conquered dynasties. To the west, Kaidu remained the ultimate holdout, a traditionalist who believed the true Mongol spirit lived in the saddle and the felt tent. He viewed his cousin Kublai as a traitor to their ancestors, a man who had traded his nomadic soul for the hollow comforts of a palace. Kaidu was a master of the Central Asian steppes, ruling the Ogedei Khanate and dominating the neighboring Chagatai Khanate with a grip as tight as a seasoned bowstring. He was a man of immense physical presence and even greater political cunning, constantly rallying the disgruntled tribes against the central authority of the Yuan dynasty. In this climate of eternal war, his children were his most trusted lieutenants, but none stood as tall or as capable as Khutulun. She was the living proof that the blood of Ogedei had not thinned or weakened through the passing generations. The Khan used his daughter as a powerful symbol of legitimacy in a culture that valued martial prowess above all other virtues. While Kublai's daughters were being married off to foreign kings to secure distant borders, Khutulun was at her father's side, planning raids and crushing rebellions. She represented the old ways, the pure Mongol identity that refused to bow to the influence of Persian bureaucrats or Chinese scholars. Her presence in the war council was a constant reminder to the tribal leaders that Kaidu's house still produced the finest warriors. The Mongols believed that the spirit of a great ancestor could be reborn in their descendants, a concept known as the soul force or Suld. Many in the camp whispered that the Suld of Genghis Khan himself had bypassed the men of the family to settle within this formidable princess. She did not just fight. She moved with a divine certainty that terrified her enemies and emboldened her father's veteran troops. To Kaidu, she was more than a daughter. She was his most effective weapon against the encroachment of a rapidly changing world. However, being the favorite of a rebel king meant living with a target on one's back from the moment of birth. Every victory Khutulun achieved was a direct insult to the legitimate authorities in the east, who sought to bring Kaidu to heel. The bloodline of Ogedei was a heavy burden, requiring them to be twice as strong and 3 times as ruthless as their rivals. Khutulun embraced this weight, turning the pressure of her lineage into the fuel that powered her legendary endurance on the steppe. Kaidu had numerous sons, 14 according to some accounts, and up to 24 in others. Yet it was his daughter who became his primary confidant and his most reliable military advisor. This preference created a complex web of resentment and loyalty within the royal household, as her brothers watched their sister surpass them in every arena. They saw her not just as a sibling, but as a rival for their father's favor and the ultimate leadership of the Khanate. Khutulun navigated these domestic minefields with the same tactical brilliance she used to outmaneuver heavy cavalry on the open plain. The wrestling matches were not merely a personal whim, They were a calculated display of genetic and spiritual superiority. Every time Khutulun threw a prince into the dirt, she was proving that Kaidu's line was the only one fit to lead the Mongol people. It was a public demonstration that the strength of the great Khan had not migrated to the palaces of Beijing, but remained firmly in the heart of the steppe. The horses she won were more than wealth. They were the currency of a nomadic power that Kublai Khan could never fully control. As the conflict between Kaidu and Kublai intensified, the role of Khutulun transitioned from a symbol of pride to a vital strategic asset. She led the vanguard in some of the most brutal skirmishes of the era, her white horse becoming a beacon of hope for her father's partisans. The rumors of her invincibility grew so loud that they reached the ears of the great Khan himself, prompting him to take the threat of this warrior princess seriously. No longer was she just a curiosity of the frontier. She was a legitimate obstacle to the unification of the largest empire in history. Kaidu knew that his time was limited and that the future of his independent realm rested on the shoulders of his most capable child. He began to drop hints that he intended to break all tradition by naming her his official successor, a move that would shock the entire Mongol world. This decision would set the stage for a civil war within a civil war, pitting brother against sister and tradition against survival. The blood of Genghis Khan was about to be tested in a way that no wrestling match could ever prepare them for. But as the whispers of her succession turned into open threats, a new shadow began to loom over the princess's undefeated record. A challenger was approaching who did not just want her hand in marriage, but sought to dismantle the very foundation of her father's power. Chapter 3. Beyond the Tower, a life of combat and horse riding. While the princesses of the Song dynasty, or the courts of Europe, were being groomed for silence and embroidery, Khutulun was breathing the sharp air of the Altai Mountains. Her nursery was not a room of stone and silk, but the vast rolling expanse of the Central Asian steppe. From the moment she could walk, her world was defined by the rhythm of galloping hooves and the smell of sun-baked leather. To understand her power, one must understand that a Mongol princess did not live in a vacuum of luxury. She was expected to manage the logistics of the camp, oversee the movement of thousands of animals, and maintain the discipline of the royal household. Yet Khutulun pushed these expectations into the background, choosing instead to shadow her father's generals through the mud of every campaign. She mastered the art of the composite bow before most children in other lands had learned to read. This weapon was a marvel of engineering, made of horn, wood, and sinew, requiring immense upper body strength to draw and pinpoint accuracy to fire from a moving horse. Khutulun spent her daylight hours practicing the Parthian shot, turning in her saddle to fire backward at full gallop. Her father, Kaidu, did not discourage this deviation from the norm. He facilitated it with the precision of a master strategist. He saw in his daughter a reflection of the ancient nomadic spirit that was rapidly fading in the sedentary courts of his rivals. He provided her with the finest stallions and the most experienced tutors in the arts of war, treating her education as a matter of state survival. For Khutulun, the horse was not merely a mode of transport, but an extension of her own nervous system. She learned to sleep in the saddle during long marches, her body swaying in perfect harmony with the animal's gait. She understood the psychology of the herd, knowing which stallion would lead a charge and which would falter under the weight of a heavy skirmish. Her training was a brutal cycle of physical conditioning that would have broken a lesser warrior. She participated in the Great Hunt, the Neige, where thousands of soldiers formed a massive circle to drive wildlife across the plains. This was the ultimate military exercise, requiring perfect coordination, endurance, and the ability to kill with clinical efficiency. In the thick of the Neige, she was not a princess to be protected, but a predator among predators. She faced down wolves and snow leopards with nothing but a short sword and a steady hand, earning the respect of the grizzled veterans who had served her grandfather. They began to see her not as a woman playing at war, but as a commander who understood the price of blood. This life of constant motion and combat forged a physique that was radically different from the aesthetic ideals of the time. Her hands were calloused from the bowstring, and her skin was bronzed and weathered by the harsh winds of the high plateau. She moved with a heavy, grounded presence, a stark contrast to the delicate, floating movements expected of royal women in the East. While her brothers competed for their father's political favor, Khutulun was earning it through sweat and tactical brilliance on the field. She developed a keen eye for terrain, learning how to use the shadows of the mountains and the dip of the valleys to hide her movements. She was becoming a master of the ambush, a ghost on the horizon that could appear and vanish before the enemy could form a line. Her presence in the vanguard of Kaidu's army was not just for show. She was a genuine combat asset who led from the front. During the long, grinding wars against the Yuan dynasty, she was often the first to break through the enemy's perimeter. Her war cry was said to be so piercing that it could be heard over the clash of steel and the screams of the dying. This immersion in the world of men did more than just sharpen her blades. It sharpened her resolve to never be a pawn in their games. She saw how alliances were made and broken, how women were traded for peace, and how often those women were forgotten by history. She decided that if she were to belong to anyone, it would be on her own terms, earned through the same violence she had mastered. The fate she avoided was the metaphorical cage of a political marriage that would have stripped her of her command. To her, a husband was not a protector, but a potential competitor who would seek to dim her light to brighten his own. She watched her sisters disappear into the courts of distant lords, their names fading into the footnotes of treaties, and she vowed a different path. This refusal to conform was not a simple act of rebellion, but a calculated survival strategy in a world that sought to diminish her. By becoming indispensable to her father's military machine, she secured a level of autonomy that was practically unheard of for a woman of her era. She was building a fortress of skill and reputation that no diplomat could breach with words alone. As her fame as a commander grew, the question of her future became a central obsession for the Mongol nobility. They could accept a warrior princess as a novelty, but they could not accept an unmarried woman holding such immense military and political power indefinitely. The pressure for her to take a husband began to mount, not just from her enemies, but from her own kin who feared her rising influence. Khutulun knew that the traditional paths of diplomacy were closing, and she needed a way to protect her independence without alienating her father. She needed a challenge so daunting, a barrier so high, that only a man of supernatural strength could ever hope to cross it. She looked at the wrestling mats of the steppe and saw her solution, turning a sport into a shield for her soul. The stage was set for a spectacle that would humiliate the pride of empires. The marriage pact was born not of love, but of a warrior's defiance. Chapter 4. The Art of Mongol Wrestling and the Marriage Pact. The sport was called bok, a word that translated to durability and strength, but for the Mongols, it was far more than an athletic competition. It was one of the three manly skills, a sacred triad alongside archery and horsemanship that defined the worth of a human soul on the steppe. In the wrestling circle, there were no mats to soften a fall and no weight classes to protect the small from the mighty. It was a primordial struggle where the only thing between a warrior and the hard, frozen earth was his own grip and the leverage of his skeleton. Khutulun understood that in this arena, her royal blood offered no sanctuary, and her gender offered no handicap. She stepped into the ring wearing the traditional zodog, a heavy, long-sleeved vest made of reinforced silk and leather that tied across the back. She stepped into the ring wearing the traditional wrestling attire of the era. It was only after her legendary undefeated streak that tradition claims the zodog was redesigned with an open front, ensuring no woman could ever again secretly compete and humiliate the men of the steppe. The marriage pact she established was a masterstroke of psychological and economic warfare that paralyzed the traditional Mongol hierarchy. She declared that any man of noble birth could claim her hand, provided he could first force her body to touch the ground in a fair match. To the ambitious princes of Central Asia, this seemed like a golden opportunity to marry into the direct line of Genghis Khan while gaining a legendary beauty. However, the stakes were high. If the suitor failed, he was required to forfeit 100 of his finest horses to the princess's personal stable. This was not merely a romantic whim. It was a calculated accumulation of the most valuable currency in the nomadic world. In the 13th century, a horse was more than an animal. It was a weapon, a source of food, and the primary engine of imperial expansion. By turning the marriage market into a high-stakes gambling ring, Khutulun was effectively building an independent power base that did not rely on her father's treasury. With every defeated prince, her personal wealth grew, and her reputation as an untouchable force of nature became a barrier that no diplomat could bypass. The matches themselves were brutal displays of endurance that often lasted for hours under the unforgiving sun. Unlike modern wrestling, Bok had no time limits, and a match only ended when a knee, an elbow, or a back touched the dirt. Khutulun's technique was built on a foundation of absolute patience, a trait she had honed while hunting wolves in the mountains. She would let her opponents exhaust themselves with bursts of raw aggression, her feet rooted into the soil like the ancient cedars of the Altai. She was a master of the clinch, using her calloused hands to grip the heavy seams of her opponent's vest with the strength of a mountain lion. When she felt the slight shift in a man's center of gravity or the tremor of fatigue in his thighs, she would strike with explosive violence. A sudden twist of the hips, a sweep of the leg, and the air would be sucked out of the stadium as another royal suitor hit the ground. The silence that followed was always broken by the sound of her father's laughter and the cheers of her loyal supporters. As the years passed, the number of horses in her possession swelled into the thousands, creating a logistical and political nightmare for the Mongol elite. The elders of the tribes began to complain that the princess was hoarding the best breeding stock of the empire, weakening the military readiness of other clans. They argued that her refusal to marry was an act of treason against the social order that kept the Mongol people united. To them, she was no longer just a warrior. She was a disruptor who was systematically humiliating the very men who were supposed to lead the next generation. Even within her own family, the tension began to reach a breaking point as her brothers watched her influence eclipse their own. They saw the marriage pact as a shield that allowed her to remain at their father's side, influencing his decisions and commanding his respect. They feared that if she remained unmarried, Kaidu would eventually formalize her position as his heir, bypassing his 14 sons entirely. The wrestling ring had become a political theater where the future of the House of Ogedei was being decided one fall at a time. Kaidu found himself caught between his deep admiration for his daughter's genius and the crushing weight of tribal tradition. He was a man who lived by the code of merit, believing that the strongest should lead, regardless of the expectations of the court. Yet, he also knew that he needed the support of the tribal chieftains to continue his long-running war against the Yuan dynasty in the east. The pressure for Khutulun to lose a match, even intentionally, began to mount as a matter of state survival. The situation came to a head when a prince of immense stature arrived from the western reaches of the empire, bringing with him 1,000 horses as a single bet. He was a man who had never been defeated in battle or in the ring, a giant whose imposing presence demanded immediate respect from the crowd. The court advisors whispered that this was the man who would finally break the princess and restore the natural order of the steppe. Even the most loyal of Khutulun's supporters wondered if her streak of 10,000 victories was about to meet its violent end. Khutulun watched the giant enter the circle, her eyes narrowing as she felt the shift in the atmosphere of the camp. She knew that this was not just another suitor looking for a prize, but a weapon sent by those who wished to see her silenced. She tightened the laces of her leather boots and stepped into the dust, the weight of an empire resting on her calloused shoulders. The giant lunged forward with a deafening roar, his hands reaching for her throat, as if to crush the life from her legend. This was no longer a sport, and the eyes of the entire Mongol world were watching to see if the warrior princess would finally fall. Chapter 5. The Undefeated Champion and Her 10,000 Horses. The giant from the west did not fall quickly, as many had expected when they saw his massive frame enter the ring. For hours, the two figures were locked in a stalemate of straining muscle and sweat-slicked skin that left the spectators in a state of breathless silence. When Khutulun finally found the leverage to hurl him into the dust, the sound was not a cheer, but a collective intake of breath from the assembled thousands. With that final grueling victory, her personal herd reached the staggering milestone of 10,000 head. In the Mongol world, this was not merely a collection of animals, but a fortune that rivaled the treasuries of minor kings. A sea of bay, chestnut, and grey horses now stretched across the horizon, all bearing the unique brand of the warrior princess. These horses were the elite of the steppe, the finest stock hand-picked from the losers of 100 different tribes and kingdoms. Khutulun did not just own them. She knew them by the cadence of their neighs and the strength of their gallop. They were her mobile fortress, a living wall of power that surrounded her wherever her father's camp moved across the high plateau. The sheer scale of her wealth began to alter the political gravity of the Chagatai Khanate in ways that unsettled the established order. 10,000 horses required vast grazing lands, often pushing the herds of other powerful nobles into the less fertile fringes of the mountains. Friction grew between the princess and the tribal elders who saw their own influence waning as her hoofbeats grew louder and more numerous. Her 14 brothers watched the dust clouds raised by her massive herd with a mixture of awe and simmering resentment. To them, every horse she won was a public vote of no confidence in their own ability to lead the family line. They saw a future where their sister did not just command the vanguard, but owned the very means of Mongol warfare and economic survival. Rumors began to circulate through the felt tents that Khutulun was using her wealth to build a private army, loyal only to her. It was whispered that she chose the best riders from among the commoners, gifting them horses from her winnings in exchange for an oath of blood. The undefeated champion was no longer just a daughter. She was becoming a rival state within the empire, a power center that could not be ignored. Kaido watched his daughter from the height of his command, torn between a father's deep pride and a ruler's cold pragmatism. He saw the way the veteran soldiers looked at her, with a fear that had slowly replaced the curiosity of earlier years. She was a phenomenon that defied the ancient laws of the sky, a woman who had successfully opted out of the cycle of submission. The Khan's advisors cornered him in his private quarters, their voices low and urgent as they spoke of the growing unrest among the clans. They argued that a princess with 10,000 horses and no husband was a recipe for a civil war that would tear the house of Ogedei apart. They demanded that he finally exercise his parental authority and force a match, regardless of the wrestling pact she had sworn to uphold. Khutulun remained largely unmoved by the political storms brewing in the wake of her latest victories. She spent her days among her animals, her calloused hands grooming the stallions that would carry her into the next season's campaigns. To her, the horses were the only honest things in a world increasingly filled with the lies of diplomats and the greed of her own kin. The physical toll of her lifestyle was etched into her features, a map of endurance that few men could hope to replicate. She was a woman of iron, forged in the heat of the wrestling ring and cooled in the biting winds of the Altai Mountains. Every scar on her arms was a testament to a suitor who had failed and a horse that had been added to her legend. But even an iron will has its limits when the entire weight of a society begins to push back at once. The Yuan dynasty in the east had heard of her growing power and saw a golden opportunity to sow discord within Kaido's ranks. They began to send agents into the camp, whispering of a princess who would eventually kill her own brothers to seize the throne for herself. The pressure on Kaido became a physical weight, bowing the shoulders of the man who had defied the great Kublai Khan for decades. He called Khutulun to his tent one evening, the air heavy with the scent of burning juniper and the musk of old leather. He did not speak of wrestling or horses, but of the survival of their people in a world that was rapidly closing in on them. He begged her to choose one man, any man, to quiet the voices of the dissenters before the camp erupted in fratricidal blood. He told her that her independence was a beautiful fire, but it was currently burning down the very house they had built together. Khutulun looked at her father, the man she loved above all others, and saw the fear in his eyes for the first time in her life. She realized then that her 10,000 horses were not just a prize, but a massive target painted on her back. The very strength that had made her a legend was now the primary threat to her father's legacy and her own safety. The circle was closing, and the next match would not be fought for a horse, but for the soul of the Mongol nation. But the shadow of a traveler from a distant land was already falling across the steppe, carrying news that would change the nature of her story forever. A Venetian merchant was watching from the sidelines, ready to turn her secret struggle into a chronicle for the ages. Chapter 6. Marco Polo's perspective on the warrior maiden. Among the many travelers who walked the Silk Road, none possessed the observant eye or the flair for the dramatic, quite like the Venetian merchant Marco Polo. He arrived at the heart of the Mongol world during a time of immense internal friction, where the lines between legend and reality were often blurred by the dust of the steppe. In his journals, he did not just record the price of spices or the weight of silk, but the stories of people who seemed to defy the very laws of nature. Polo spoke of a woman he called Aegean, a name that shimmered with the same celestial light as the moon over the Altai Mountains. To the sophisticated European, she was a figure of pure myth, a warrior maiden who stood nearly 7 feet tall and possessed a strength that could crush the spirit of the bravest knight. He described her not with the soft language of courtly love, but with the clinical respect one might afford a high-functioning siege engine. When he watched her ride, he saw a creature that was more spirit than flesh, moving with a predatory grace that unsettled the foreign dignitaries. Polo noted that she would often ride into the thickest part of a battle, plucking an enemy soldier from his saddle as easily as a hawk might snatch a rabbit from the grass. This was not the stylized warfare of the European joust, but a brutal and efficient display of physical dominance that left the Venetian breathless. He marveled at the fact that her father, the great Khan Kaidu, deferred to her judgment in matters of strategy and logistics. In the courts of Venice or Paris, a woman's influence was often relegated to the shadows of the bedchamber or the whispers of the parlor. Here, under the endless blue sky, Polo witnessed a princess who stood in the open sun, her voice carrying as much weight as any general in the imperial vanguard. His accounts captured the visceral atmosphere of the wrestling matches that had become the talk of the Eastern world. He wrote of the tension that hung in the air like a coming storm, the smell of sweat and horse leather mingling with the scent of roasted meat. Polo watched as princes from distant lands approached the ring with a mixture of lust and terror, their eyes fixed on the woman who held their honor in her calloused hands. To the Venetian, the wrestling was not merely a sport, but a ritual of selection that defied all Western logic. He observed that while most men sought to win a bride through gold or lineage, Khutulun demanded a price that most were unwilling to pay: their dignity. He recorded the sight of defeated suitors limping away from the circle, their heads bowed as they handed over the reins of 100 horses to the woman who had just humiliated them. Polo's writings provided a bridge between the isolated world of the Mongol steppe and the burgeoning curiosity of the Renaissance. He was the first to translate the raw power of the Mongol woman into a language that the West could understand, even if they could scarcely believe it. Through his eyes, Khutulun became more than a local curiosity. She became a symbol of a world where the traditional boundaries of gender were being systematically dismantled by the necessity of survival. Yet, even as he praised her strength, Polo could sense the growing danger, that her independence posed to the stability of the empire. He noted the way the court officials looked at her with a mixture of reverence and growing resentment, their smiles never quite reaching their eyes. He understood that in a world built on the foundation of patriarchal succession, a woman who could not be conquered was a living threat to the very order of the state. The Venetian chronicler saw the cracks forming in the relationship between the princess and the tribal elders who sought to control her. He recognized that her 10,000 horses were a wall she had built around herself, a barrier that even her father was beginning to find impenetrable. Polo's perspective was that of a man watching a tragedy in slow motion, knowing that such a brilliant light could not burn forever without attracting the shadows of envy. He left the Mongol courts with his mind filled with the image of the warrior maiden standing among her vast herds, her eyes fixed on the horizon. His accounts would eventually travel back to Europe, where they would be dismissed as the fantasies of a traveler or the exaggerations of a merchant. But for those who had seen her in the dust of the ring, there was no doubt that the woman Marco Polo described was the true master of the steppe. As the Venetians' caravan moved westward, the political climate in Kaidu's camp reached a boiling point that no amount of wrestling could resolve. The time for games had passed, and the reality of war was returning to the borders of the Khanate with a renewed and terrifying ferocity. Khutulun was no longer just a champion of the ring. She was about to become the primary target of an empire that could not afford her existence. The sound of the wrestling horn was replaced by the low, haunting drone of the Mongol war trumpets. The princess would soon find that the most dangerous enemies were not the ones standing in front of her in the ring, but the ones standing directly behind her throne. Chapter 7. Military Command and the Trust of Khan Kaidu. The transition from the wrestling circle to the theatre of war was seamless for a woman who had spent her life treating combat as second nature. While the marriage pact had secured her wealth and a legendary status, it was on the open plains of Central Asia that Khutulun truly earned her place at the right hand of the Khan. Kaidu did not merely keep her by his side for protection or sentimentality. He transformed her into the most lethal instrument in his military arsenal. In the hierarchy of the Mongol army, the position of the vanguard was reserved for the most fearless and tactically astute commanders. It was the tip of the spear, the first unit to taste the blood of the enemy, and the last to retreat from a collapsing line. Khutulun took this role not by birthright, but by proving she could maintain discipline among thousands of hardened riders who initially viewed a female commander with skepticism. Her presence on the battlefield was a psychological weapon that Kaidu deployed with surgical precision against the forces of the Yuan dynasty. When the banners of the House of Ogedei crested a ridge, the sight of the princess leading the charge sent a ripple of unease through the ranks of Kublai Khan's generals. They were not just facing a seasoned strategist, but a woman whose physical prowess was said to be blessed by the eternal blue sky itself. Khutulun's style of leadership was defined by a brutal, hands-on involvement that left little room for the comforts of her royal status. She was known to sleep on the bare earth alongside her soldiers, sharing their meager rations of dried meat and fermented mare's milk. This shared hardship forged a bond of loyalty that was far more resilient than the traditional oaths sworn to her brothers. During the height of the border skirmishes against the Great Khan's armies, she developed a signature maneuver that became the stuff of military legend. She would lead a small, elite group of horsemen into the heart of the enemy formation, moving with a speed that defied traditional heavy cavalry tactics. Once inside the chaos, she would identify the enemy commander and personally drag him from his horse, effectively decapitating the opposing force's leadership in a single stroke. Kaidu watched these displays of tactical genius with a growing conviction that none of his 14 sons possessed the necessary fire to lead the empire after his passing. He began to invite Khutulun into the inner sanctum of the war council, where the maps of Asia were unrolled across low tables and the fate of millions was decided. Her voice, once confined to the cheering crowds of the wrestling matches, now carried the weight of life and death for the entire Khanate. The trust Kaidu placed in his daughter created a toxic atmosphere within the royal family that threatened to implode the house of Ogedei from within. Her brothers, many of whom were competent warriors in their own right, felt their legacies being erased by the shadow of their sister's growing command. They saw every military victory she secured as a nail in the coffin of their own political ambitions. The Khan's advisors warned him that elevating a woman to such heights of military authority was a direct violation of the Yasa, the secret code of laws established by Genghis Khan. They argued that while a woman could be a warrior, she could never be the ultimate source of sovereign power without shattering the unity of the tribes. Kaidu, however, was a man who valued merit above tradition, and he saw in Khutulun the only mind capable of holding back the tide of the Yuan expansion. This unwavering trust culminated in Kaidu's decision to place the entire defense of the eastern frontier under her direct supervision. It was a move that effectively bypassed the traditional military hierarchy and placed the survival of the state in her hands. Khutulun accepted the responsibility not with a sense of triumph, but with the grim realization that she was now fighting a war on two fronts, the one across the border and the one within her own camp. As the late summer of 1301 approached, the conflict between Kaidu and the Yuan dynasty reached its final, desperate crescendo. The princess spent weeks in the saddle, coordinating the movements of tens of thousands of soldiers across a landscape that was as unforgiving as the enemies they faced. Her ability to read the shifting winds and the subtle movements of the steppe allowed her to outmaneuver generals who had decades more experience than her. Despite the brilliance of her maneuvers, the political pressure on Kaidu to name a male successor reached a breaking point. The tribal chieftains began to withhold their support, demanding a guarantee that the empire would not fall into the hands of a woman, regardless of her military talent. Kaidu found himself in a position where his love for his daughter and his belief in her genius were in direct conflict with the survival of his dynasty. The bond between the aging Khan and his warrior daughter was tested in the fires of these final campaigns, as they both realized that their time was running out. Every charge they led together was a defiant statement against a world that was determined to force them into traditional roles. But as the banners of the Yuan appeared on the horizon for one last, massive engagement, the stakes shifted from political influence to raw survival. In the height of the summer heat, the two armies collided in a valley that would soon become a graveyard for the Mongol elite. Khutulun rode at the head of the center column, her eyes fixed on the golden standard of the enemy, unaware that the greatest threat to her life was already riding just a few paces behind her. The battle that followed would not just decide the fate of the borders, but would force Khutulun to face a betrayal she never saw coming. In the heat of the slaughter, she would realize that the most dangerous weapon was not the sword of an enemy, but the silence of her own kin. Chapter 8: Political Tensions and the Refusal of Traditional Roles. The dust from the secret burials of the 1301 campaign had barely settled before the political daggers were drawn. In the aftermath of the brutal clash against the Yuan forces, the camp of the House of Ogedei was a place of mourning and simmering rage. Khutulun sat in her tent, the copper basin of water turning dark as she washed the grime of the frontier from her hands. Outside the heavy felt walls, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that no victory could soothe. The tribal elders and the 14 brothers of the princess were no longer content to whisper in the shadows. They saw a Khan who was aging and a sister who was becoming far too powerful to be contained by tradition. The marriage pact, once a source of legendary amusement, had become a political crisis of the highest order. For years, Khutulun had used the wrestling ring to maintain her autonomy, effectively vetoing every attempt to use her as a piece on the diplomatic chessboard. To the conservative Mongol elite, This was not just a personal preference. It was a dangerous defiance of the social contract. A princess was expected to be a weaver of alliances, a vessel through which the bloodlines of rival clans could be merged. By refusing to marry, Khutulun had essentially severed a vital limb of the empire's foreign policy. Her independence meant that her 10,000 horses and her elite vanguard remained a private power that served only her and her father. Her brothers, led by the ambitious Chapar, began to coordinate their efforts to isolate her from the sources of power. They argued that her presence in the war council was a violation of the natural order and a curse upon their house. They painted her military success not as a gift to the people, but as a provocation to the gods who favored the rule of men. Kaidu, sensing the walls closing in, made a decision that would send shockwaves from the Altai Mountains to the shores of the Yellow Sea. He summoned the great assembly of the clans, the Kurultai, to discuss the matter of his succession. In a voice raspy with illness but firm with conviction, he declared that Khutulun was the only one fit to lead the Ogede line. The silence that followed his announcement was more terrifying than the roar of any charging cavalry. The clan leaders looked at one another, their faces masks of disbelief and rising hostility. They had tolerated a warrior princess in the vanguard, but they would not tolerate a female Khan on the throne. The refusal of traditional roles had now placed Khutulun in the center of a target that spanned the entire steppe. She was no longer just a daughter or a general. She was a revolutionary figure whose very existence demanded a total restructuring of Mongol society. The political friction began to generate a heat that threatened to melt the very foundations of their unity. Threats of civil war began to echo through the mountain passes as disgruntled chieftains returned to their own territories. They began to withhold taxes and men, starving the central government of the resources it needed to hold the borders against the Yuan. The empire was being torn apart not by external enemies, but by the refusal to accept a leader based on merit rather than gender. Khutulun watched as the people she had bled for turned their backs on her in the name of ancient customs. She saw the fear in the eyes of the commoners and the naked greed in the eyes of her own kin. The horses she had won in the ring were now being prepared for a conflict that would pit brother against sister in a race for the soul of the nation. Even as Kaidu's strength ebbed away, he refused to rescind his choice, creating a vacuum that the ambitious were eager to fill. The princess realized that the wrestling matches of her youth were nothing compared to the bloodless, soul-crushing combat of the imperial court. Every smile from a courtier was a hidden blade, and every promise of loyalty was a lie waiting for the right moment to be revealed. The tension reached its zenith on a cold autumn night when a secret envoy from the Yuan dynasty was discovered in the camp of her brother Chapar. The betrayal was no longer a theory. It was a documented reality that threatened to hand the Khanate to their greatest enemies. Khutulun knew that the time for debate had passed, and the time for a final, decisive action had arrived. She stood on a ridge overlooking the vast expanse of her father's domain, the wind whipping her hair against her scarred cheeks. Below her, the fires of 10,000 soldiers burned like a constellation of fallen stars, each one a potential enemy. The warrior princess who had never lost a match was about to enter a ring where there were no rules and no mercy. But as the first snows of winter began to fall, a shadow moved through the royal tent that would change the course of history before the sun could rise. The ultimate betrayal was not waiting on the battlefield, but in the very hands that held the Khan's last cup of medicine. Chapter 9. The Struggle for Succession and the Empire's Shadow. The flickering oil lamp in the Khan's yurt cast long, dancing shadows against the heavy felt walls as the soul of Kaidu departed. For 30 years, he had been the iron pillar holding the house of Ogede against the relentless pressure of the Yuan dynasty. Now that pillar had crumbled, leaving a void that the howling winds of the steppe seemed eager to fill. Khutulun stood at the bedside, her hand still resting on the cooling skin of her father's arm. She did not weep, For a Mongol princess of her stature knew that tears were a luxury the dead could not afford and the living could not use. Outside, the rhythmic drumming of the night watch had stopped, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight upon her chest. The decree of succession lay on a low table, its ink dry but its authority already evaporating into the cold mountain air. Kaidu had named her his heir, a decision that challenged centuries of patriarchal tradition and the pride of 14 brothers. She knew that as soon as the sun rose, the ink on that parchment would be worth less than the dust beneath her boots. In the neighboring tents, her brother Chapar was already gathering his captains, his eyes fixed on the golden belt of the Khanate. He did not see a sister who had saved his life on the battlefield. He saw an obstacle that needed to be removed with surgical precision. The shadow of the empire was no longer a protective canopy, but a dark shroud falling over the family. The news of Kaidu's passing traveled with the speed of a prairie fire, reaching the ears of the Yuan generals who had waited decades for this moment. They knew that a house divided could not stand, and they prepared to feast on the remains of the Ogedei resistance. To them, Khutulun was the most dangerous element of the succession, a wild card who could either unify the tribes or burn them to the ground. Khutulun retreated to her own camp, where her 10,000 horses stood like a silent army in the moonlight. These animals were her dowry, her wealth, and her personal guard, representing a power base that no other brother could claim. Yet she understood that horses alone could not win a civil war fought in the whispers of the court and the darkness of the night. The struggle for succession began not with a charge of cavalry, but with the systematic isolation of the princess. Her supply lines were diverted, her messengers were intercepted, and her most loyal commanders were offered titles and gold to switch their allegiance. The shadow grew longer as the tribal elders began to publicly question her right to lead based on the ancient yasa. They argued that a woman on the throne would bring a curse of barrenness to the land and weakness to the military. These were the same men who had cheered when she threw princes into the dirt. Yet now they used her gender as a weapon to strip her of her birthright. Khutulun realized that the wrestling ring had been a playground, while the struggle for the crown was a slaughterhouse. As the weeks passed, the fragmentation of the Khanate became a visible scar across the landscape. Different factions began to fortify their own territories, turning brothers into rivals and cousins into enemies. The unity that Kaidu had spent his life building was being traded for short-term gains and personal vendettas. Khutulun found herself trapped in a paradox of power where her very strength made her a target for everyone. If she fought her brothers, she would weaken the empire and invite a Yun invasion. If she stepped aside, she would betray her father's final wish and leave the people to the mercy of men who valued ambition over duty. The shadow of the empire began to eclipse her legend, turning the warrior princess into a fugitive within her own borders. She spent her nights moving her herds and her loyalists, never staying in one place long enough for Chapar's assassins to find her. The vastness of the steppe, once her playground, had become a labyrinth of potential betrayals. In the high passes of the Altai, she held a secret council with the few commanders who still remembered the oaths they swore to Kaidu. Their faces were etched with the exhaustion of a campaign that had no front line and no clear enemy. They looked to her for a sign, a strategy that could navigate the impossible terrain of a collapsing dynasty. Khutulun looked out over the valley, seeing the campfires of her brother's army glowing like embers in the distance. She knew that the time for running was coming to an end, and the time for a final confrontation was drawing near. The struggle for succession was no longer about a throne. It was about the survival of the Ogedei spirit in a world that wanted it dead. She tightened the cinch on her saddle, the leather creaking in the stillness of the pre-dawn light. Her brothers thought they were hunting a princess, but they were about to remember why the great Khan had chosen her above them all. The shadow was deep, but it was in the darkness that a warrior's true nature was finally revealed. The first arrows of the civil war were nocked, and the air hummed with a tension that threatened to snap the very spine of the Mongol world. Khutulun raised her hand, and for the first time in her life, she prepared to charge against her own blood. The destiny of the steppe hung on a single command, but the voice that answered was not the one she expected. Chapter 10. The immortal legacy of Khutulun in Mongol history. The civil war that followed Kaidu's death did not end with a grand coronation, but with a quiet retreat into the echoes of history. Khutulun, realizing that a total victory would require the complete annihilation of her own brothers, chose to prioritize the survival of the Ogedei line over her personal claim to the throne. She eventually met her end in 1306, falling in a skirmish or perhaps succumbing to the exhaustion of a life spent in constant motion. Her physical passing was not an ending, but the moment her life transitioned from historical fact into a living myth. The 10,000 horses she won in the wrestling ring were dispersed among her loyal followers, seeding the steppe with a lineage of animals as resilient as their mistress. Even as her brother's short-lived triumphs faded into the dust, the story of the undefeated princess began its journey across the world. Today, the most enduring monument to her life is found in the heart of every Mongolian wrestling match. Before and after a bout, the wrestlers perform the dance of the eagle, spreading their arms and opening their heavy silk vests to the sky. This tradition, featuring a tunic that leaves the chest exposed, is said to have been introduced to ensure no woman could ever again secretly enter the ring and defeat the men. It serves as a ritualistic insurance policy, a reminder of the time a woman entered the circle and proved herself superior to every warrior in the empire. While the names of the Khans who succeeded her are often forgotten by the common people, every wrestler who steps onto the grass honors her memory. She remains the invisible referee of the Mongolian soul, a standard of excellence that requires no crown to validate. Her legend traveled along the Silk Road, carried by the journals of Marco Polo and the chronicles of Persian historians. By the time her story reached the grand opera houses of Europe, she had been reimagined as the icy Princess Turandot, a figure of riddles and distant beauty. Yet the real Khutulun was never a cold enigma locked in a palace. She was a woman of mud, blood, and the open sky. She remains a singular figure who redefined the boundaries of power in an era defined by patriarchal steel. Khutulun proved that a woman could hold the vanguard of an army and the respect of a nation through sheer merit and physical dominance. Her life was a defiance of the script written for her, a refusal to be a diplomatic pawn in a game played by men. In the modern era, she has become a symbol of national identity and the untamed spirit of the nomadic world. Her image appears on posters, in films, and in the dreams of young athletes who seek to find their own strength. She represents the idea that one's destiny is not dictated by birth or gender, but by the courage to step into the ring and refuse to lose. The House of Ogedei eventually crumbled, and the great Mongol Empire fractured into a dozen different fates. But the image of the princess in her traditional lamella armor, her hair braided for war, remains etched into the collective memory of the East. She is the eternal warrior, a reminder that some spirits are too vast to be buried by the passing of centuries. We look back at Khutulun not as a relic of a vanished world, but as a blueprint for the modern rebel. She taught us that to be undefeated, one must first be willing to stand alone against the weight of tradition. Her story is a masterclass in the art of living on one's own terms, regardless of the political storms that howl outside the tent. History is not merely a record of what happened, but a gallery of those who dared to make it happen differently. If you found inspiration in the undefeated spirit of the Mongol princess, subscribe to join our journey through the annals of the world's most extraordinary lives. Share this story to keep the legend of Khutulun riding across the digital steppe for generations to come.